Our next speaker, once we switch over, I'll introduce Nerea. Nerea Calvillo is an architect and researcher and curator, having obtained her PhD at ETSAM Madrid in 2013. The work produced at her office, C+, and her visualization projects such as In the Air, here in our exhibition, have been presented and exhibited, published at international venues like the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the Contemporary Art Museum of Chile, Laboral Art and Industrial Creation Centre. She's a Poesis Fellow at NYU, Assistant Professor at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick, and a Unit Master at the Architectural Association. Nerea investigates the material, technological, political, and social dimensions of environmental pollution, and her current work is on toxic politics, pollen, and queer urban political ecologies.
Well, thanks first of all to Lindsay and Anthony for inviting me to be here today. It's a luxury to be one day speaking about air. Quite unlikely, so I'm very, very excited to see other presentations and to have discussions later on. So making the air visible has been, since boy, a scientific endeavor to better understand the climate, and more lately, climate change, involving sensing instruments, experimental bodies, and institutional networks. Since the late 80s, however, air pollution maps and visualizations have become essential tools to render the air accountable to government and citizens. And yet, visualizations of the air pollution, and other topics related to climate change have had difficulties in addressing citizens' and policymakers' imagination. So this presentation unfolds how the air is built as a matter of concern through the devices that render it visible. But is the aim of making the environment visible to represent a truth, as most scientific and policy-making maps do? Or is it a way of interfering with the world, as Anne-Marie Moore and other feminist scholars of technoscience are claiming? In Latour and Wilger's account of the laboratory, inscriptions have to circulate in order to gain relevance, and therefore interfere in the world. They need to be moved around. But I would say that sometimes this circulation is not possible. Maybe because the visualization may not be showing a new fact, and secondly, because it may not emerge from a center of power, such as a scientific context as Andy's, for instance. And I'm wondering, what is the capacity of interfering with the world of visualizations that are made in media labs, for instance, in architecture schools, in contexts where actually visualizations of the air either are not expected or may not have scientific guarantees. So the process, as Donna Haraway claims, the process of making visible in itself can also be a way of interfering with reality. By looking specifically at the agency of making visible the air itself and how things are made visible. For instance, how to decide what is worth seeing, with whom, for whom, under which conditions, and how the invisible asks or allows itself to be made visible in a very specific way. Yet, that is not all. What I am after is how different ways of designing an aerial map construct what I've called airscapes, with completely different implications. So, through design decisions, I claim that this design decisions, different stories can be told about what air is, and more specifically, what air pollution is or can be. And in this context, these design decisions become world-making techniques, which can contribute and respond to eventually current critiques of science and technology studies, where they claim that a description of reality is only a description, doesn't have politics. And I would want to claim that actually depends on how we make things visible. The stories that we're telling are different, and therefore that's a way of engaging into political discussions. So Making airscapes can be practices of care and holding together the object of inquiry, as Maria Puig de la Bella Casa has argued. So, and I need to make a note here. What I'm going to be talking about is visualizations of air pollution. So they're not going to be simulations, as we see there at the back, neither models as we saw previously. So there are very, very basic visualizations from data that comes from the City Council's web pages. So this is how most institutional web pages show air pollution. They show the data that comes out of the measuring stations. And I wonder, what does this tell us about air pollution? And what does it tell us about air pollution in relation to the urban environment? So, in my view, this is a map of the management of air pollution in an institutional context. But actually, I don't understand much, actually, what happens in the city. There's other models, as Andy has explained very well, so I won't go into detail, that interpolate in between the different measuring points and actually simulate and model all across different sites. But they have all the problems and difficulties that Andy has very well brought to the fore. So because of the resolution at an urban scale, it is all, again, very difficult to understand what is actually happening. So I initiated in 2008 a project called In the Air that has been produced with lots and lots of collaborators. It's been a collaborative project since the beginning, and it's still an ongoing project in which we try to think about other ways of understanding and seeing air pollution in relation to the urban landscape. So In the Air aims to reframe the institutional way of displaying air quality through numbers, and what matters are not the numbers or the concentrations of the different pollutants, for example, in themselves, but what matters is the relationship in time between those pollutants and across the city. For this purpose, we used a topographical mesh as a relational entity, as you can see here in the image, and the different components were interpolated not to see absolute concentrations. So you can see here that each color is a different component, as you can see in the legend, but they were all interpolated through a maximum line, which is the limit that the EU gives for health purposes. So those are the legal limits that the EU sets up for cities and governments. So what we cared about in this project was not exactly the quantity of pollutants, but actually where in the city it was more polluted. So we were actually interested in the environmental conditions of air pollution. And what we aim to design and to make visible is the toxic landscape of Madrid in this case. So by representing the data, we constructed the space that it generates. It is the airscape of the toxic, where one can see the pharmaton capacity of the air, of being good and bad for our bodies according to the concentrations, the weather, or the location. This space of the toxic enables to decide how and where we want to see the air. If it's from below us, as we'll see in a minute, or from on top, as a landscape or as a depiction, forcing to engage with a partial perspective, as Haraway demands. So actually we need to decide with this digital application that two of our collaborators created, and we need to decide how to engage with air pollution, whether we want to experience it as a space here from below, situating ourselves at specific locations in the urban, or actually to study it from a more scientific way eventually, or to understand better the relationships all across the urban from a more distant perspective. So We aimed to enhance a sensorial experience with the air and its visualization by navigating the space. So some scholars have been searching for the ways in which air is felt, as Tim Choi or Nick Shapiro, for instance. Could this be an instrument to expand these modes of feeling the air through digital sensation? So as you can see, when the air gets red and its particles, what of course changes most during the day, when each color gets red is when it's past the limits provided by the EU. And what was really interesting was to understand how different pollutants behave in very, very different ways. So actually, normally we speak about air pollution either in general or just saying, well, X levels of CO2, CO, NOx, NO2, etc. But actually, how do they perform? And what are the implications with the body and with the city? And we started finding out that ozone, for instance, it's very, very constant all across the city and in time. And particles and NO2 are the ones that are most fluctuating in time and space. And what was interesting is that after the year after, we tried to see if actually the air pollution is an indicator of what happens in the city. As if you see these nodes that come here, we tried to read the data from the application that collects and goes back in time since the beginning of the project, and we were actually able to read the activities of the city through the data of particles and NO2. So we were able to identify football matches, festivities, New Year's Eve, it gets totally polluted. So it was actually, we were able to identify when there were strikes. So it was actually a very, very detailed representation of what had happened in Madrid in the previous year. A few years ago, we started to think about what are the implications of other components of the air that are not necessarily gases and particles, or let's say non-organic particles. And we started looking at pollen. And pollen is a fascinating object of study because it challenges in a very, very interesting way what pollution is or can mean or how can it be framed. So pollen in the air brings us to a totally different realm. And this was a prototype that we developed for Laboral for an exhibition on Airscapes. It shifts the focus of pollen as a harmful to humans, as most pollen apps do. I don't know, is anyone asthmatic here? Okay, lucky you. So most pollen apps inform about the levels of different pollen seeds. But we try to think about what would it mean, how would we read the pollen and the city differently if we only not knew the health impacts, but also it gave us more information about the green ecologies in the urban space. So we try to read pollen in a way from a more than human perspective and an ecosystemic based approach. To do so, I drew on Hustag and Meyer's work on affective ecologies, where they describe how plants and insects have interactions beyond productivity, where they communicate, they have pleasurable or sexual encounters, and where the objective is not necessarily to produce or reproduce, but actually to have more queer experiences between each other. So, what is the landscape of a pollen that is in itself a reproductive unit, that serves as food for bees, that pollinates other plants, flies with the wind, and yes, eventually makes some of us sneeze? So we decided to put pollen airscape upside down, reversing the human-centered aerial perspective. In this visualization, humans are floating with bees or pollen particles. And instead of connecting it to human health, we cross the data with the data sets of the trees in the city. So when pollen activates, we can see which trees and plants are blossoming at a precise time and location. So it is not the landscape of risk or health prediction, but the landscape of plant, wind, and animal intercourse. With this in mind, we tested another visualization device, focused not on numbers, but on intensities of things. Because if we think about it, demarcations are impossible to define in the air. And that's one of the difficulties, of course, with modeling. And therefore, we used particle clouds as the visualization strategy, which from the beginning takes into consideration the material properties of the air, enacting the air of queer ecologies where multiple species have physical connections and construct various types of effects. Is it moving? Yeah. So actually, you can see how different species start blossoming, and how one can navigate the space of Gijón, a city in the north of Spain, in relation to pollen. But I want to claim that visualizations are also can be a research method that enables to inquire not only the object of research as air pollution, but also its socio-technical assemblage. So one of the fundamental things, and I won't go into detail about this section of the paper that draws on method, but what I'm trying to think is how doing the visualizations without knowing anything, which is what happened to us actually. We had no idea of air pollution when we started the project, neither on pollen, and we just started to looking at the data and try to understand what the data meant. And we were thinking how often, as architects, we just get the data from somewhere, put it into a model, and think that we are taking X into account. And actually, when we started thinking what we were seeing, we started realizing how little we knew about the object of inquiry. But what we realized on the way was that by making the air visible, the particles, even if we started with very specific and kind of abstract numbers, if you will, we started identifying who was making that data public, why they were making the data public, who was in charge of collecting the data, which institutions were actually collaborating to produce the data, and what were the challenges and the problems between them, whether getting the data was really difficult, and then what are the policies and the politics behind making data visible. So we started getting to understand the politics of the transparency of public data, all the different institutions that are assembled in order to make those data appear in the web pages. And for instance, things as specific as when we were doing the pollen project, we were trying to get the data sets because they only published graphs in their web page, and it took us, I don't know, like 3 months to get a proper data set, and actually it was outdated. And when we asked, well, why can't we have the latest ones, they claim, well, actually because the counter has been broken for 2 months, and because of the crisis, we cannot repair it. But it doesn't really matter because you have the data from a city that is like 200 kilometers far away. So actually you have data. We're like, but we're researching this city. Yeah, but it's more or less the same. So all these politics and the devices, and then we started researching the devices because how can it be? How is it so expensive? So you start understanding the whole process of data gathering, the difficulties, the implications. So actually, I'm claiming that this is a very interesting research process by which the visualization is the entry point and not the last stage of the research. And also, it allows us to take into consideration the specific and ontological conditions of the air. So actually, the fact that we were researching air and not something solid was requiring us to represent the air in different ways. So it required to take into consideration time. So some people in the group had these ideas of really, really fancy visualizations that were awesome, but were actually not working for air pollution. And What we wanted was to actually let the air speak. Nothing else, or nothing more, I would say. But it also, I think it can be a research method, interdisciplinary, of course, that enables different forms of collaboration. And this has been fundamental throughout the development of the project, because the configuration of the group was prior to the development of the group. So this has been developed in Media Labs, as I said at the beginning, and through open calls. So we actually, when we got together, I had no idea which expertise we had in the team. So actually, the configuration of the team shapes and leads the project in different directions. So it's a research method that it takes into consideration interdisciplinarity in a very, very deep way, because it's not about the experts, but about what are the skills and capacities that enable the project to go in one direction or another one. For all these reasons, it has to be an open method, more an attitude than a set of protocols, attuned to the messy process of testing and bringing together, taking into account the human and more than human support and care involved in these practices. As Eric Manning notes, each step will be a renewal of how this event, this time, this problem proposes this mode of inquiry, in this voice, in these materials, or this way. At times, in retrospect, the process developed might seem like a method, but repeating it will never bring it back, for techniques must be reinvented at every turn, and thought must always leap. So basically, the method has only one clear step, which is start designing and making the visualization. But compared to other research methods, and I've been exploring these mostly in the social sciences, where they ask me all the time, why is this different to other research methods? Like, why would we do this? My claim is that making visualizations is another way of doing, not better or worse than others, but I think it adds something extra, or may add something extra. And I take now Derek McCormack's thinking about doing atmospheric things, and I'd like to see these visualizations as a device for a form of practical aesthetics in which different qualities of atmospheric space-times can be experimented with. So actually, there can be means of experimenting and not only seeing air pollution. And that's what we've been trying to do with different iterations of different ways of exploring the air, because in the air has been fundamentally interested in how different ways of making visible create different airs. So in this prototype for a diffuse facade, for a public space, what we tried to do was to understand how we could understand air pollution without numbers and through intensities of water vapor, and how that would transform how we speak collectively about air pollution eventually in a public space, but also how this device also transforms and changes the physical conditions of the public space, because it reduces temperature and increases humidity, which in Madrid, for instance, in the summer, can be a very good thing to have. But also we've explored wearables, and we've explored how using this tool as a research tool can also give us ideas on the relationship, for instance, of particles and land price in Madrid. So to conclude, I believe that in order to engage with the air, we need to find other modes of knowledge production. So we need to add and keep finding ways of understanding the air, because no matter how many different fields are exploring it, I think still we don't know much about it. And my take on it is that we don't need to find the best visualization, the best model, the best map, but actually to multiply them to increase the possibilities of action. So each representation enables different entry points to act and intervene. And eventually, to produce public images that may create atmospheric imaginaries that may help us collectively to see and understand what is up there. Thank you.